Good morning and welcome to our daily devotional. We're continuing our read of A View from the Zoo by Gary Richmond, who worked at the LA Zoo during the 60s and 70s. And this chapter is called The Black Widow, so I hope you enjoy it. The greatest lesson I ever learned from the animals was not learned at the zoo. It was learned in a mossy, moldy greenhouse in the backyard of a lady I was sure was a witch. Spring was just giving way to summer, school was almost out, and like all 8-year-old boys, I was looking forward to 3 months of no shoes, except on Sunday, and a creative string of adventures yet to be lived out. My mother was just beginning to fix dinner when the afternoon stillness was broken by the persistent ring of the front doorbell. At the door stood an older man. His tie was loosened and he was drenched with perspiration. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and began his to-the-point presentation, one that had probably been given 50 times before coming out to our front door. "Hello, ma'am. My name is Edgar Beasley, and I'm from the health department. We're going door to door to alert people to the fact that they need to spray for black widow spiders. I bet you have already noticed that there are more spiders than usual. Doctors are reporting many bites that they feel are probably black widow bites. Last week, a little girl nearly died from one. So we're here to warn you that we're having an epidemic of black widow spiders in California. This sometimes happens after a real wet spring." He handed my mother a little book and said, "Ma'am, here's a pamphlet that gives you some real important facts and information about black widows. It shows you what they look like, and more importantly, what their webs look like. We'd be sure obliged if you'd spray." When Mr. Beasley left, my mother scanned the pamphlet. She stared at me with legitimate concern and said, "Gary, if I ever catch you so much as walking by a black widow spider, I'll spank your backside shiny. Do you understand me, young man?" I nodded that I did, and she handed me the pamphlet. I was fascinated. On the cover was a menacing picture of a female black widow. She looked large and was posed so that she revealed the red hourglass on the underside of her shiny black abdomen. The pamphlet made note that she lived in an irregular web that would likely be found in dark places in garages, wood piles, and under cabinets. The section that most caught my interest was entitled, "The Bite of the Black Widow Spider." It said that a person who was bitten might experience the following symptoms: discoloration at the site of the bite, nausea, a severe headache, unusual swelling, labored breathing, and blurred vision. It concluded that some children even died from the bite of a black widow spider. My mother never realized that she had just provided a roadmap for my next great adventure, a black widow safari. I couldn't wait to tell my best friend Doug about the greatest idea of my life. "Now here it is, Doug. On Saturday morning, my parents will be gone for 3 hours. I figured that will give us time to catch 10 black widow spiders. We can take them bandits down to Elliott Junior High School and dump them in the red ant hill that I found. It'll be great. The red ants will come streaming out to protect their home, and there will be a scary fight. The red ants will win, and we'll have done our part in Altadina's battle to fight the black widows." "What if we get bit?" Doug said. "We're not gonna let those child killers get us. We'll be real careful. Hey, you're not gonna chicken out on me, are you?" "Well, no," Doug added defensively. I made Doug perform the blood brother handshake and promised not to tell any soul that we were going to do on 8:30 in the morning on Saturday. He took the oath, knowing that if he broke it, his teeth and hair would fall out. I found an old peanut butter jar and poked a few holes in the lid. We didn't want any of the spiders dying before they got a chance to fight the red ants. We chose a 2-foot long stick for catching the spiders, and then we hid our safari gear behind the garage until Saturday. As soon as my parents left to go shopping, I ran to Doug's house. He was already waiting for me in the front yard. We grabbed our gear and headed for my backyard. I had already located several webs. On the way there, we ran into another good friend, Eric, who was coming over to see me if we could play. We finally decided we'd better let him in, but we made him take an even more solemn oath than Doug had taken. "What kind of oath?" asked Eric. "The kind that if you break it, something scary will happen." Eric really wanted it, and so he took the oath. "I, Eric, promise never to tell about the Black Widow safari. If I do, the devil will make my mother's hair fall out." "What?" "You heard me, Eric. Do you want in or not?" "It's just that I don't want the devil around my mom." "Are you planning to tell someone?" "No." "Then you don't have anything to worry about. There's a reason for this, Eric. You're not very good at keeping secrets, and this will help you." "Okay," said Eric. "If I do, the devil will make my mother's hair fall out." "That wasn't so bad, was it?" asked Doug. We walked down our long, overgrown driveway and ran right into my 12-year-old brother, Steve. Before we could stop him, Eric blurted out, "Guess what, Steve? We're going to catch 10 black widow spiders and dump them on a red anthill. Isn't that neat?" My brother then treated us to the words we'd least like to hear. "You guys are too young." Boy, I hated those words. Steve told us we were too young to catch black widow spiders, but agreed it sounded like a good idea. He offered to catch the spiders for us, and if we were good, he would let us hold the jar. As we followed my brother to the backyard, I held up my fist to Eric and said, "I'm never going to tell you a secret again, and I hope you're thinking about what you just did to your mother, you oath breaker." I sadly handed over the catching stick to my brother, and Doug reluctantly handed the peanut butter jar to me. Eric was trying to visualize his mother bald and wondering if she would know that it was his fault. It took only a minute to discover the first spider. She was residing behind our tool shed. Her web was spun between the fence and the shed and bore the evidence of many a successful hunt. The dried bodies of 3 moths and 2 flies were mute reminders of her deadly capacities. We crowded behind Steve to watch him catch the first of the 10 spiders. He managed to get her on the end of the stick and called for me to open the jar. With trembling hands, I opened the jar, and with a tap of a stick, it received its first prisoner. She was medium-sized and looked none too happy about being caught. She looked just like the spider on the pamphlet, and when I lifted the jar, we were able to see the bright red hourglass on her shiny black abdomen. As the jar began to fill up, my job became more and more difficult. The 5th spider attached a web to the lid so that when I opened the jar for the 6th spider, I pulled the 5th across my hand. After we had caught 8 spiders, we faced a dilemma. We ran out of spiders to catch on our property. Steve wanted to stop at 8, but I insisted that since we had agreed to catch 10, that's exactly the number we should catch. Steve gave in. But he had no idea where we should hunt next. Eric, who had been the quiet observer on the safari, made the suggestion. "I bet the evil queen of the Black Widow spiders lives in Mrs. Brown's greenhouse." Mrs. Brown lived next door to Doug, and all the neighborhood children were really afraid of her. And she hated small children, and called the police on them if they even set foot on her property. Some of us were convinced that she was a witch, and could cast spells that could keep us under her power and things like that. What made Eric's idea so attractive was that catching the spiders had become too easy, and besides, my brother Steve was having all the fun. It was such a great idea that Eric was forgiven for breaking the oath, and we told him so. He said he was glad because he couldn't get used to the idea of having a bald mother. He said he thought it might be embarrassing. Doug suggested that we sneak into Mrs. Brown's property from his backyard. Her greenhouse was in the very back of her backyard, so Doug's suggestion was taken. We peered over Doug's fence into the untrimmed jungle that made up her yard and concluded that she was not outside. One at a time, we dropped into forbidden territory and slipped silently into the greenhouse. It was damp and dark, musty and moldy, perfect for black widows. We all felt that Mrs. Brown would jump out and grab us at any moment, so we asked Eric to keep watch. Underneath her gardening bench was a 5-gallon red clay pot. It was the kind my mother used to pot a small palm tree. It was turned upside down and resting on 3 red bricks. It was Steve and Doug turned it over slowly and carefully. We each drew in our breath at what we saw. At the bottom of the clay pot was the largest black widow we had ever seen. She was fat and seemed to be throbbing with poison. She was protecting her silky white egg sac, and unlike the other spiders, she was simply not afraid of the stick. After considerable effort, Steve was able to get the deadly giant on the end of the stick. He called for me to open the jar. I shook the jar until I was able to count the 8 spiders we had already captured. Carefully, I turned the lid and removed it from the jar. I stood there with trembling hands while Steve brought the stick to the mouth of the jar. Just at that moment he was going to tap, she made a jump for it. She landed right between my bare feet. I backed away, and in the excitement, I forgot to put the lid back on the jar. My full attention was direct to the escapee between my feet, and I watched with rapt attention as my brother struggled to get her on the stick. I failed to notice that the medium-sized female was crawling out of the jar and onto the back of my hand. Slowly, I became aware of an eerie sensation and stared in disbelief at the little killer that was taking a morning stroll on my hand. I let the jar slip through my fingers, and the black widows began to run everywhere. They mattered little anymore. The game was over. I was unable to speak words that had meaning, but I had managed a pretty good sound. I believe that phonetically it sounded a little like, yeah! My brother looked at me, and it was clear that he was experiencing fear also. Now, I believe that our fear was of different natures. The fear I was experiencing was because of the first time in my life I really believed that I was going to die. Not like in Cowboys and Indians where you could get up again, but the sort of death where everything goes dark, and after that, I wasn't sure what would happen. It took all my strength to keep from fainting. I could feel every footfall of the spider on the back of my hand. I stayed perfectly still. I begged my brother with my tear-filled eyes to please get the spider off my hand. He moved his index finger in a flicking position to within an inch of the spider. I held my breath and wanted to close my eyes, but I was afraid that if I did it would be for the last time. The spider stopped as if to consider the threat the finger was going to pose, and when she did, Steve flicked it with all his might. The spider went flying. I have never felt a great sense of relief in my life. Neither have I before or since learned a more important truth. Someday, I'm going to die. How you feel about that truth has everything to do with how prepared you are for it. If you have no belief in God or a future existence, then it really doesn't matter how you live your life. On the other hand, if you do believe in God, then everything you do matters. The Bible has 2 verses that really intrigue me. The first is found in Hebrews 9:27. It is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment. We were designed to die. To die once is part of what being a man is all about. We have an appointment with death, and nothing we can do will make us early or late. Listen to what James has to say concerning his view of life and death in James 4:3-15. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we shall go to such and such a city, and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know that your life will be like what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. The scripture clearly teaches that there is a God, and what we do matters a great deal to him. It's also clear that whatever it is that we're going to accomplish needs to be accomplished before we die. The wisest man who ever lived wrote a dissertation on the search for truth and wisdom. His final words and conclusions are as follows in Ecclesiastes 12:13-14. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And that concludes the chapter for the day. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe write down in the comments something you got from this, or maybe about some spider story that you want to share with the rest of us so that we can all just sit here all day going like this. Anyway, have a good day, and we'll see you tomorrow.